So I just have to set the stage first. These are Chautauqua-style presentations. If you haven't heard of Chautauqua-style, it is a form of presentation whereas there will be a scholar. You're all going to recognize her, of course. She's fabulous. But Chautauqua-style means we're going to go back in time. We're going to pretend like we're not in the present. This person will talk and act like a certain character, who I will tell you about that. So, we're going to hear from a very famous lady here in the Valley. She will talk for about 20 minutes or so. And then after that, if you want to ask her questions in the time period as a character, you are more than welcome to. We'll do that at the end. And then after that, our character will leave us and we'll come back to the present day with our scholar. And you can ask the scholar then any questions about the research of the character or anything like that. So that's kind of what the Chautauqua-style presentation is about. So our first character is not scandalous. Don't worry, she's the second one. This one is a strong one. This is a strong woman who came here to the Valley. And you haven't heard of her. Her name is Captain Ellen E. Jack. And we're going to travel back in time. We're not going to be at the Wheeler Opera House. It's not going to be 2019. The year is 1903. So the crash happens here in Aspen in 1893. So this is about 10 years later. But we're not even going to be in Aspen. We are going up High Drive, which is outside Colorado Springs, up Bear Creek. And you're going to all pretend you are tourists traveling by car to visit Captain Jack at her tourist cabins and curio shop. So, you can take photos for a price. So everyone, please welcome Captain Ellen E. Jack.
Okay. Welcome to you all. I'm glad you could make it. You had a safe drive up the hill. I hope it was an interesting journey, if nothing less. And I hope you're here to, please, pictures, of course. Go ahead, here, let me get my axe. That'll be $5. She laughs. Well, welcome. I hope you're all in for a lovely evening. Dinner is being prepared. I just got back from a round over on Cheyenne Mountain where, well, I shouldn't really disclose, but I believe I found a cave bigger than the Cave of the Winds. No. So, more shall come. Please come and visit me more often. I don't know, have you ever met a female prospector before? Well, I got to tell you a little bit about myself, because I'm not your ordinary prospector. First off, I am a woman. I ain't afraid of man or the devil. You know, if he can shoot straighter or faster than I, let him go ahead and try. A 45 equalizes man and frail woman. I think every woman ought to be able to defend herself against such ruffians.
Amen. Amen.
However, this is what I have learned in my life. I've been 27 years here in the West, but I was actually born in England, Nottingham, England. That's where I was born, one of 9 children, raised on a beautiful farm that had belonged to my family for over 300 years. And my brothers entered into the military, my sisters did very well. We lost one sister to a fire, unfortunately. We had beautiful property, and I have to tell you just one story. This is my first story. You see, when I was 7 years old, the Goose Fair, which is held every year in Nottingham, was taking place just down the road from our farm. And I remember seeing the wagons coming in with the gypsies. And, you know, it was against the law for the gypsies to camp along the side of the road or in a land that wasn't owned by them. So they saw this beautiful farmland, and the queen of the gypsies came to me. It was the Boswell family gypsies. She asked me who owned the land. I said it was my mama. She asked me to take her to my mama, which I did. And my mother offered to let them stay for £5 she paid to stay on the ground. And the queen promised not to harm a blade of grass in the 3 weeks that they would be there. My mother did ask, though. She'd heard gypsies had the habit of stealing children, and would thee take mine? My mother asked. The queen of the gypsies vowed not to harm a hair on my head or any other head. She did, however, tell my mother that I was a Rosicrucian, a finder of hidden treasures, and that I would travel great distances, and that if I had been born a man, I would have been a great miner. She also said that I would be a widow at a very early age, and that fires would bring much sorrow and losses to me. I remember these words, and they all came true. Now, I grew up playing on the farm. My father finally decided to sell the farm and move to Manchester. He opened a brewery business, which failed miserably. We lost all of our family money. I went to live with one of my sisters, and it was there that I met my first love, Carl. He was Russian, and he was handsome, and he was educated, and he was a musician. And we would spend days rambling through the woods and singing and reading poetry together. And Carl vowed to take my hand in marriage, and I gave him my promise. Unfortunately, Carl was called back to serve in the military, and after 3 weeks of his return to Russia, in my sadness, my cousin asked me to join him at the opera. And I reluctantly went. That evening, following the performance, which I paid no attention to, my mind was far away with my lover. I was on the sidewalk. I was feeling faint, and my cousin Jack went to procure some roses for me. While he was buying the bouquet of roses, I was suddenly attacked and stabbed with a dagger on my bosom 3 times. I was so in shock, it was hard for me to imagine when I opened my eyes and saw Carl stabbing me. He said he did not want to see me alive would I be wed to another man. He was mad with jealousy. Now I fainted for loss of blood. Carl was arrested and thrown into jail. I was taken home, and they found that the stab wounds were about 1.5 inches from my heart. And my heart, although it took a long time to recover, was broken from the sadness. How could a man who had promised me his hand with such confidence have been so savage? I convalesced for 18 weeks with my sister, and all that time, Carl was in jail. He finally paid a hefty fine, and when he was out, he came and called upon me, wanting to be with me, and I was so frightened of him, and my sister made sure that he was never allowed in the house. My sister decided it was a time for me to travel to America. So she and her husband took me at the age of 17 on a ship to New York City. It was an amazing journey. I was seasick for the first few days, but then the air cleared, and it was a lovely passage for a few weeks until a storm came. The storm was so terrible, we all had to take shelter down in the lower berths. People were being injured, and, for some reason, I've always found myself able to bear the sight of blood. And I actually had to assist a doctor in the amputation of a young Irish girl's legs that had been crushed as she was thrown against a steel door. Now, when we landed in New York City, I had never seen anything so beautiful in all of my life. It was a beautiful harbor, and we stayed at a beautiful hotel that was right on the corner of Broadway and 14th Street. We stayed for 6 weeks, and then I became ill. I became jaundice, and as my sister and her husband returned, I was unable to make the voyage. So they secured a nurse who cared for me until I was then able to travel back to England. This was in March of 1860. And on that journey, as I was boarding the gangplank, still very, very sick with jaundice, the first captain came down, lifted me in his arms, and carried me aboard. And I am told from him that he claimed at that moment he was going to wed that canary. You see, my face was as blonde, was as yellow as my hair. He wooed me for 5 weeks on that journey, and when we landed in England, he had to return with the ship under contract back to New York City. But he vowed to come back and wed with me. And in September of 1860, I wed Charles E. Jack. And we returned to New York City to live with his family in Brooklyn. Shortly thereafter, my husband entered into the Navy, and we entered into the Civil War. My husband took the tests and became a captain. and worked under Farragut's fleet and was down in New Orleans and suffered some severe injuries at that time. But following the war, he returned and worked within the Navy Yards in New York, and we had a beautiful small home up in New Rochelle, and his family was still in Brooklyn, and I'd had my first child, Nettie. Nettie was a lovely girl. She lived to be 5 years old. She died shortly after my son was born. My son contracted scarlet fever, and Nettie joined him. On her deathbed, she said to me, "But Mama, I must go with him, and you will join us, and we will all be together one day." My heart was broken. My husband returned to serve more in the military, and as I was lonely, I began to help and care for those who were in need on Randall's Island. Shortly thereafter, my third child was born, Jenny. She was a light. And 2 years later, my fourth child, Daisy, born in the spring, as you can imagine, and named after the beautiful flower because she lit up a room. Now, Daisy was a rare child. Why, I remember a Christmas shortly after my husband died. You see, Charles was 15 years older than I, and he had suffered severe injuries in the Civil War that affected his heart, and his heart failed him. And on his deathbed, again, I heard voices that said, "Do not worry, let him go. We will take care of him." And in the corner of the room, I saw Nettie and my boy waiting for my husband. He joined them shortly thereafter. My grief, a pen cannot describe the suffering that I went through. That winter, having to take care of my girls as best I could with what little money I had, I began to invest in real estate in Prospect Park area of Brooklyn. I bought a large plot of land and I built a very large hotel. It was the Bon Ton Hotel, and we did very well. I've always had a way of knowing what to do next. I made very good investments, and we made very well through the hotel. I bought several presents for my girls that Christmas, and Daisy, I found, was gone on Christmas morning. And when I found her, she was down the block where an old beggar woman had nothing to eat, and my Daisy had brought her her Christmas dinner. Daisy was a rare and gifted child, I said. Daisy, too, was lost to scarlet fever. At this point, my heart was broken. I could no longer stay in this city. I could no longer stay with this family. I gave my daughter Jenny to my sister-in-law. I enrolled her in boarding school and made sure that she would be taken care of forever. And I headed west. I made off to Denver. When I arrived in Denver, I ran into our old nurse girl, Jenny. Jenny looked beautiful, beautifully dressed. We met on Holiday Street, and I found out that not only had she married upon leaving my employment, but that her husband had not treated her fairly. Her husband had beaten her when he would return in the evenings. One night she followed him to see where he was, and she found that he was spending his nights in a sporting house, enjoying other women. Well, this not only devastated Jenny, it burned her, and she decided that she would spend the rest of her life making men pay. For why should a good woman have to suffer when the women who were enjoying the gaiety and laughter and love have all the benefit? So Jenny had opened a sporting house on Holiday Street. She was going by the name of Madame Clara Dumont. I went to visit her under an assumed name myself, as I was not accustomed to visiting sporting houses. And she told me that I should travel west to Gunnison, a new city, a mining camp at that time, still. So I encountered a group of men that had a stage heading off towards Gunnison, and after 3 days' wait, I journeyed with them. I was the only woman, but I had my 44 with me. And that, in itself, was enough to secure my position on the stage in the eyes of these men, one of whom was Alva Adams. who has been our governor twice here in the state of Colorado. He was a hardware merchant at that time, heading to the Gunnison camp. When we arrived in Gunnison, there were many men and not many homes. I was able to meet a cowboy named Hall who helped secure some land for me. I bought 2 large lots. I secured a tent and the lumber was delivered, and I put up a large tent and began to charge men and freighters 50 cents a night to stay. I had a beautiful long dining table made and 3-legged stools so that I could serve dinner, and I began to prepare meals. One fall, why, the Ute Indians were still in the area, in the agency, and in that fall, I came home one day to the tent to find the Indians were dancing around and eating all of the beautiful apples that I had procured. Well, I was dismayed, and soon they were surrounding me, and I heard a man shout, "Hold your ground! They've caught into some firewater, but they only want to touch your hair." You see, I was a blonde back then. So I went to the Chief Colorado, and I took his hand, and I undid my hair, and I let him touch my hair. In fact, he was so enamored that I cut a lock off and I pinned it onto his blanket, and he kept it with him. It was in another Ute uprising that played very well to my benefit. You see, the Indians had come into town and they had knocked over lanterns, and oil had started fires all throughout town, and I took my .44 and I shot it up into the air, and the gunshots brought other men that came to start the fight, and as the fight was going on, I was hit in the head with a tomahawk, and I fell to the ground, not realizing that I was bleeding profusely. It turns out the tomahawk had been poisoned. And it was Chief Colrose who came to save me. As he came through town under a white blanket, shouting, "Pale lady, I come to save Pale lady, Pale lady." Because of my friendship with him, he was able to cure me. He put something on my head that I wore for weeks, a paste, and gave me a pill the size of a bullet. After several weeks, a blood clot burst, and the poison was free from my body, but I still have the scar, which is why I wear my hair down over my forehead. Now, many men found me irresistible, I must say. It was difficult for me to thwart off all of their advances. But I made it very clear that I was to be left alone, and I found very good allies who helped me with that. Several of them were prospectors, and in the course of that, I began prospecting. I began to search through the mountains and learn of all the minerals that were there. And in fact, I took a half interest in the Black Queen Mine. It was 1 mile north of the city of Crystal, up in the mountains in between Aspen and Crested Butte. And getting there was no easy chore because there was no road. But I made my journey there several times and secured our options there, and we began to produce quite a bit of ore. $20 a ton was what was being pulled out of that mine. And all of that rock had to be carried back down the mountain with mules and burros, and I became very accustomed to all of this lifestyle. Hardly what I had thought would be the point of my life. But several of the men that I met along the way thought they could take advantage of me, being a fair, blonde woman. Now, Mr. Walsh, he was 20 years older than I, and he was very educated, he was very smart, and claimed to have lots of money from his family back in Cincinnati. He asked me to wed, and I said no, I thought better of it. But he kept insisting, and eventually I thought, well, he is older, therefore I would have both father and husband. And so I agreed. We went to Denver for the ceremony, and the night before the wedding, I heard the crying of several children's voices, crying and pleading with me not to do it. "Do not marry, do not marry," they kept saying. And in fact, as we were standing in front of the priest, about to put the rings on our fingers, I heard a man's voice loud and clear over my shoulder, so loud, screaming, "No!" that I dropped the ring. It rolled on the ground. The priest picked it up, gave it to Mr. Walsh, who shoved it onto my finger, and we were wed. Well, Mr. Walsh went off to tend to some business, and I waited for him, and I waited for him, and I waited for him that day. He did not return at 5 o'clock. By 6:20, I boarded the freighter and headed back over to Gunnison. It was 2 weeks before Mr. Walsh came again. It turns out Mr. Walsh was not a man of integrity. Mr. Walsh was actually a con man, as I have learned. And he was after my mine. He wanted half of whatever I owned, which includes Jack's cabins, which included the mine, which included, I forgot to mention my boarding house here in Aspen. You see, in 1885, I had traveled over the mountains from Crystal, over what I believe now is called Maroon Pass, into Aspen. And I did it in the wintertime. And I did it on a night when the men were too afraid to go. You see, there'd been a wash and there was a gully, and a man and his horse had already been killed. There were several men that were building the road eventually to come up over that way, and they pleaded with me not to go. Do not continue your journey. But I knew I had to go. My voices were telling me, go on, go on. And at this point I had learned that I should listen to what I was hearing. So I traveled on. When we came to that wash, it was a crevice that we both, my horse and I, and the dog that was traveling with me, Mandy, had to jump. And as we did, I was unsure of what was found on the other side. But we landed safely. We continued on and made our way down into Aspen. When we arrived, we were approached by so many people asking, how did we possibly do it? Did the other men come with us? Have we heard from them? You see, that night before I had come into town, having crossed the crevice and camped for an evening, I heard crying and screaming, which I assumed to be that of coyotes and wolves. It turns out there was a great avalanche that took the lives of all the men that were working on that road. And had I stayed with them, I would not be here today. So I listen to the voices now as they tell me what to do. I came into Aspen and I built a beautiful house on a corner lot, and I started renting rooms and serving food. I made $400 a month here. But I had to go back to the Black Queen mine to tend to my interests, because you see there were men that were trying to steal the ore from my mine. And when I went and found them with bushels on their burros and about to leave with the minerals that belonged to me, I began to shoot. And as I did, the burros and the men fell down a cliffside. There were several men killed and 7 burros as well. Now the stories became exaggerated, and it sounded as though I had killed 7 men. Well, that was not entirely true, but I was arrested. And I was arrested for protecting my own property. And I was acquitted. I was arrested again. Sorry?
The voices.
I couldn't quite hear them, though. So, you see, I was arrested a second time, and this was because I was collecting pension from Mr. Walsh, and it turned out I was never really married to Mr. Walsh, because you see, Mr. Walsh had already been married. He had a wife and 2 children whom he had sent off to Canada. Come to find they died from diphtheria. And Mr. Walsh, he too eventually died, but I had to spend years and a fortune in the courts trying to prove myself and my rights. It turns out that I ended up getting the pension from Captain Jack. And all of his back money and pension are what I sank into these beautiful cabins here, outside of Colorado Springs. You see, I'm getting a little too old to be prospecting and mining and fighting off mountain lions and avalanches. It's a bit much for me. So I have decided that I am going to open this curio shop and write a memoir. You see, I've only told you a few of the stories of my life. There are so many, many more, and many of them are true. And if they aren't, they ought to be. I'm happy that you are here this evening. I would encourage you to buy a postcard. I would encourage you to come back and visit often. And I do believe that this will be my next great fortune. Thank you.